We're starting on a new book as we continue on and we turn the pages from Genesis chapter 50. The next page is actually Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, it has a period that has gone, well, considerably long, right? After the death of Joseph that we read. So now we continue in chapter 1 of Exodus, and the book of Exodus gives us a background. And this background sounds like this. These are the names of the children of Israel, and that would be Jacob. So remember that Jacob's name is also Israel or Israel, who came to Egypt. Each man and his household came with Jacob. So you can see that there is an interchangeable name, Israel and Jacob. And hence, from verse 2 onwards, it lists out the names of all the sons. Let me just recall this for you. We have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zebulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, as well as Joseph. And if you do recall when we had the book of Genesis, I think we should be able to remember that Reuben is the first son, and he's one of the most important sons because he is the firstborn. Simeon is number 2, Levi is number 3, Yehuda or Judah is number 4, and number 5 is actually Dan. Number 6 is Naphtali. Number 7 is Gad. Number 8 is Asher. Number 9 is Issachar. Number 10 is Zebulun. And then number 11 is Joseph. And number 12 is Benjamin. And if you recall, Rachel or Rachel died during childbirth of Benjamin. And so here we have 70 people, as is mentioned here. What I think we would also remember is that in Genesis chapter 46, we do read that there were 66 of them who came with Jacob. And then here we have 70, and that's because Joseph is plus wife, and then plus the 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And thereby we have 70 people. Now this is important because if you recall in Genesis chapter 15, when God made a covenant with Abraham and said that your descendants will be sojourners or visitors or foreigners or aliens in the land that is not theirs. This is that land, which is Egypt, or the Hebrew name is Mitzrayim. And when they went in, they were 70 people, and God said, for 4 generations, for 400 years, then only you will come back. And so what we do see is that we need to look at Israel right now as a family of 70 people that will come out as a nation. And this is that story in the book of Exodus. Whatever we read in the book of Exodus, the big picture is the transformation of the family to a nation. 70 people doesn't make a nation. A nation will be comprised of many, many people. And when we read in Exodus later on, particularly in chapter 13 and 14. When they came out of Egypt, we are no longer looking at 70 people. We are probably looking close to 1 million. And that is a nation. Now, the second thing I wanted to point out to you is this, that the fact that God let them into Egypt, as you can read all the chronology, as how they sold Joseph into Egypt, and he went through a lot of terrible persecution, and still he kept his integrity and his faithfulness to God, and God lifted him up to be the prime minister of Egypt, and thereby saved the family of Jacob because of the famine. And God must have let the famine on and help Joseph interpret the dream so that these 70 people can be protected under the powers of Pharaoh, so that they had the chance to grow in number and not be lost in the land of Canaan where they will be fighting. And so this whole book of Exodus is the fulfillment of what God said in Genesis chapter 15. Now, moving on, in verse 6. Okay. In verse 6, we do read of the fact that Joseph died. And you must remember that Joseph is one of the youngest. He's number 11, which means that between Reuben and Joseph, they were all quite senior. And Joseph died, all his brothers also died, and all that generation also died. But the children of Israel were fruitful. The word fruitful here means that they were able to bear a lot of fruit. That's what it means to be fruitful. And this is, I guess, a Hebrew way of saying that, wow, no, you are able to increase. And so here, fruitful and increase abundantly are just two ways of saying the same thing. The word increase abundantly is like in Genesis chapter 1, when God made the fish of the sea. These were teeming or swarming. It gives the imagery that, wow, there's so many of them. That is the impression that you get from this word, increase abundantly. So fruitful and increase abundantly is actually talking about the same thing. One is to be able to count, and the other one is visualizing that they are all over the place like ikan bilis, right? The next one is many. Multiplied is to be many, to be numerous. In fact, all these four were different descriptions of how they increase themselves. Now, the last one is interesting because it speaks of the fact that they were very united. They grew exceedingly mighty, but the picture that is given is at some, and it is like, how would you say? At some comes from the word ex, which is like bones. They grew very strong, right? Very strong. And the reason why they were very strong was because they were together as one people. And hence, when you look at verse 6, this is the whole description of how they grew from 70 to so many people, but there was no number given here. We have to be careful because the Bible is very concerned about counting the Israelites. The last phrase here is that the land was filled with them. The land of Mitzrayim, when it says filled, uh, it literally means that you could find them everywhere. Right? That's the picture that we're given. That the land was so many of Israelites that they were literally everywhere. That's the beginning part, and chapter 1 gives us the background. Moving on. In verse 8, it tells us that there were new kings that arose. Now, the word arose means it came up. So you find that when one pharaoh dies, another pharaoh is said to arise to take the throne. And so this word king is the generic word, and pharaoh is just another word for king, and particularly over Mitzrayim, Egypt. But this one does not know Joseph, which means that there has been a number of generations, and you know that Joseph used to be the prime minister, and when this new king came up, we don't know how many generations down, he doesn't know who Joseph is, and he doesn't know the background of the story. All he can do is he could see, look at this people of the children of Israel, they are more and mightier than we. It would be scary for this new king because the children of Israel just kept growing. And it seems, or it appears to the king, that they are going to be overrun by these foreigners because together they can do many things. And so they are said to be mightier. So in verse 10 comes this word. Let us be wise. Right? This word is be wise. Let us be wise with them. What about being wise? It is to know how to deal with this so that they can control the situation. And so they said, in case they multiply and then something happens, like say in the event of a war, that Egypt were to fight with other people, that these children of Israel will join our enemies and then fight against us. And then they leave the land. Right? And they leave the land. And so with this in mind, they then put themselves taskmasters. What is taskmasters? Taskmasters are the chiefs of forced labor. So they forced the children of Israel to do work for them. And in this case, they feel that they can afflict them. The word afflict them is to cause them to be lowly. It's actually to humble them. That's the word. To humble them so that they dare not think of grand plans. And then to do it by giving them burden, loads, things to do. I guess you could call this forced labor. And this type of labor is not easy labor. So I have to do hard work. Now, many people think, and then I guess we all have watched Charleston Heston in the movie Moses, right? Or the Exodus. And you see them doing hard labor, and they were building pyramids. Actually, in this passage here, they were never building pyramids. They built for Pharaoh supply cities. These are storage places. Storage for food. And it's for Pharaoh. And there were two particular places, Pithom and Ramesses, right? Ramesses. And the more they afflicted them, the more they put them into to be humiliated, to humble them, the more they grew. They multiplied and grew. So the word multiply is from the idea of being many, right? Grew, and the word grew here is to burst forth. What it means is they grew to such a number that it became very uncontrollable. Uncontrollable. And they became the dread. It is a grief. All the things that the taskmaster gave were causing them to become disgusted of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. What this means, rigor is perek, which I think it could be translated as harsh or cruel. So this is like a vicious cycle. The more the Israelites grow, the more scared the Egyptians were. And the more scared the Egyptians were, they became more and more cruel. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage. That's verse 14. Bitter is bitter. It's a hard life. It's how should we say? It made them very sad, disappointed, angry. These are all the feelings that come with all this hard labor. And so what were they doing? Hard labor. They were making mortar, bricks, and all kinds of work in the plain, in the open field. And all their service which were made for them was to serve with rigor. And like you said, this is in harshness, right? Cruel. Now, we would have seen pictures of taskmaster having whipped. If you don't work, they get whipped, and they were forced to continue this hard labor. And so that would be the picture here when we see this passage from verse 8 to verse 14. The picture is one who doesn't know Joseph. The picture is they are all very scared. The Egyptians, they are growing, so many of them. They are going to be powerful because they were united in what they do. And so they thought that they would just humble them, make them do hard labor, become cruel to them, and they would have power over the Israelites. And that would be the feeling and emotions that verse 8 to 14 is supposed to conjure, to put in our minds. And the Bible is written in words. And when we hear these words, the children of Israel would understand that this is a hard time, that they can feel it in their bones, they can feel it in their emotions, in their heart, that this is a very cruel and humiliating period of time. And they were in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Now, there was another plan that the king of Egypt hatched. So the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Midwives are people who help them bear children, right? I think we used to have them in our country. Nowadays, everybody would go to the hospital. But in the good old days, there were no hospitals for childbirth. They were always born at home. And so the Hebrew midwives were their own people, the ladies who would go and help women give birth when it was time. And so the king of Egypt said to all these midwives, the people who helped the women give birth, and they were of the Hebrew stock, and one was Shifra. Shifra, and the other one was Puah. And he said, you know, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and you see them on their birth stools, the idea of the birth stool is that they were actually lying down on the stones, ready to give birth. And when you see them ready to give birth, you take a look. If it is a Ben, and that would be a son, right? Then you shall kill him. Actually, the idea here is you shall cause him to die. Cause him to die. Right? Put him to death. That's what it means. Shall kill him. Somehow he needs to die. Now, if it was not a Ben, but it was a bite, that means that it was a daughter, then you just let her live. Verse 17. But the midwives, this is a key word, feared God. And remember, I kept explaining to you that the word fear is to be afraid. This word literally says that the Hebrew midwives were afraid of God. It also means that they were more afraid of God than the king of Egypt. So there was a comparison. So the word fear here is in comparison. You are afraid of the king of Egypt, but then you are also afraid of God. Now you can't be both equally afraid. So in this verse 17, it describes to us the attitude of the Hebrew midwives, that they were more afraid of God than they were afraid of the king of Egypt. And so because of that, they saved the male children. Now, what do you mean by they saved the male children? The idea here was they kept them alive. Now, in verse 18, after a while, I think the king himself would have smelled a rat. And so the king of Egypt called for these two ladies and said, "What have you done? Why did you keep the male children alive?" Now, obviously, this is not a nice conversation. This would be an interrogation by the king. And so, verse 19, the midwife said to Pharaoh, in the reply, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. How are they different? They are, it says here that they are lively. Lively means they are vigorous. They have the vigor of life. Vigor of life. The word vigor of life means that they have the energy and the excitement when giving birth. And so the midwives are saying they are very active. And so the reason is that before the midwives come to these Hebrew women, they have already given birth. And so this was the excuse that was given to Pharaoh. Now you notice that this is an excuse that is not true. And we never ever see God chiding them or disciplining them. In fact, the contrary was true. This is not our modern understanding of lying. This is the protection of life. And so the protection of the sanctity of life, and more importantly, the Hebrew life, the children of God, was more important. And so in this case, it is very much like how we have read in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham told Pharaoh that Sarah is my sister, right? And so on and so forth. And so this is the protection of the life of the children of God. So what actually transpired was this. As we come to the close of chapter 1, God indeed rewarded them, dealt with the midwives. Verse 20 actually means to make good, right? To make good or do well with them, make them well. And the idea of dealing well is to bless them. Now, we don't know what God did with them, but it made them happy, and that's what God responded to what the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, did in these two verses, explaining to Pharaoh. And so God dealt with these midwives very well. And the people, the Hebrew people, again, they kept multiplying. And that would mean in verse 20, they kept bearing more and more children. And then they grew into very mighty people with strength, because they were all very united. And so it was because the midwives feared God. And say, you read this again, second time. That tells us that this is important. You need to fear God more than Pharaoh. And so because they did that, God provided. And this idea is make their house for them. Literally, God made the house for them. And so God provided, God fulfilled, God gave them things that their house is complete. But yet the Pharaoh himself kept saying to all his people, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, every daughter you shall save alive. And this is a command for all his people, the Egyptians, to make sure that every son of the Hebrew people were killed. Just throw them into the river and let them be. This was the Pharaoh's predicament, because the numbers kept growing and he didn't know what to do. Now, let me just pause here and mention this. Although this is said, we should never assume that every single male child were kept alive. In the archaeology, we do realize that there were many male babies' graves that were found, which means that there was a time where many male babies had died. And this rule that Pharaoh had given out was said to have taken place, but not effective. And what that means is, though Hebrew male children were killed, there were many more who survived. That is what these verses are intended to say. It is not to say that there were no male children that died. There were many male children that died, but there were many more who were kept alive. And that is the background of chapter 1. So in a nutshell, I think we can safely tell that the emotions that's brewing between two peoples. One, the Egyptians, they are scared. They are scared that these Hebrew people kept growing, and so they had to become a tyrant, become cruel to them, force them to do things so that they will not grow. But yet they grew. And so Pharaoh then came out with a second plan. All the male children that are being born, they should be killed. And yet they grew. And that is the predicament. And the more they grew, the more scared Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. Now, the second group of people that were mentioned here were the children of Israel. The 70 people that went into Egypt or were in Egypt as a family of Israel or Jacob had now become so large in number that they became a major threat to the politics and the economics and the powers there be, because they were afraid to be overthrown by these people when an enemy came. And so putting them in hard labor to be humbled. Unfortunately, the English word used here is rigor, but to be humbled and humiliated would be the way. And the feeling there would be that you feel that you're no longer welcome in Egypt, and now you are forced to do hard labor so that you continue to become subservient to the masters of the land. And finally, the third one would be the children, the sons who were born. And they were the ones who were now in the game. That many died, but yet many survived. And with them surviving, there were more children born to the children of Israel. And hence, we close chapter 1 with this picture. Turmoil. No longer peaceful. No longer welcome. The people were feeling the cruelty and the tyranny of their masters of the land, trying to subdue them and to humiliate them so that they will continue to listen to their masters of the land, and thereby made their lives very miserable and very grievous. We will continue next week. Please read ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor.
Bye.
Bye.